The Terrifying Lies podcast, with music and stories by Craig Nybo. Greetings, friends, and welcome to the Terrifying Lies podcast, where we delve into the deepest recesses of the human soul. I'm your host, Craig Nybo, and I consider you all my friends. Today's episode marks the end of an epic 10-part saga called Red Annex. If you haven't listened to parts 1 through 9, I advise you go back and tune in. Otherwise, you might find yourself walking aimlessly through the streets of some faraway, apocalyptic, ruined city with no way of knowing how to get out. Back Terrifying Lies by visiting my Patreon. It's patreon.com/terrifyinglies. Your contribution, no matter how small, goes a long way toward keeping this show on the air. If you like Terrifying Lies, why not get behind it with just a few bucks a month? Enough of that. Let's get into today's story, shall we? Previously on Red Annex, a U.S. Army Special Forces team infiltrates the San Fernando Annex, where residents have contracted a virus that causes insanity and cannibalism. Their mission to recon and rescue falls apart when a militant faction of the infected attack. The team must divide into various tasks of the mission, some to recover captured brothers-in-arms, others to vaccinate a group of non-hostiles holed up in an old church. Now back at the evacuation point, the entire team must fight their way to the Chinook that has come to lift them back over the concertina walls to safety. Can they slog through hundreds of hostiles and get home safely? Well, you'll have to listen to find out. And now for the conclusion of Red Annex, written and performed by me, Craig Nybo. Chapter 33. Extraction plus 34 minutes. Wilmore sprinted, clutching his M249 machine gun close until his side threatened to burst. Just as he reached the point where he couldn't run another yard, he pushed on, grinding through the ache, forgetting about his fatigue. He moved laterally against the group of diseased enemies' advance on the Christian Center refugees. He needed to position himself so that when it came time to open up his weapon, he wouldn't catch Peltier, Tuttle, and their protectorates in the crossfire. The mob focused on the refugees, oblivious of Wilmore's presence. He'd keep it that way for as long as he could. When he felt he had arrived at a safe tactical position, he raised the 18-pound saw and pointed its muzzle roughly in the direction of the enemy. The weapon's weight slowed his sprint to a sideways peel, but the hostiles could never outrun 200 rounds of belt-fed 5.56mm bullets. The saw clattered out its lethal song. At the back of the rush, some assailants keeled over, belting out their agony and horrid yowls. Others fell into instant blackness as they folded to the lawn, never to make another sound. The mob fell into confusion. About half of them, oblivious of Wilmore's damage to their numbers, continued their advance toward Peltier and Tuttle. The other half stopped and turned around to investigate what had caught them from behind. A woman raised a .30-06 rifle and fired. The bullet thudded into Wilmore's right pectoral, immediately numbing his arm. He staggered backward a pair of unsure steps. Despite his loss of feeling, he managed to keep his grip on the saw. He glanced down and confirmed that the round hadn't penetrated his ceramic body armor. But even with a bulletproof vest, he'd come off lucky. Encouraged by the woman's shot, half of the hostiles set off toward Wilmore. Wilmore raised his saw and backpedaled. He winced on raw pain in his chest and shoulder as he aimed, having to heavily support the rifle with his left arm. He pulled the trigger and panned a continuous stream of fire back and forth across the approaching crowd, letting off from fire only for short gaps to realign his aim. More of the infected fell. Those with guns used them. Wilmore caught a bullet in the hip. Another channeled a clean path through his right thigh. Wilmore collapsed onto his back. He knew he couldn't get up without help. He hoisted himself to a sit-up position and freshened his aim. About 15 more of the bastards approached. He let the saw hammer out its deadly narrative. somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew that he had almost depleted the M249's 200-round magazine of linked ammo. A bullet thumped into the grass inches from where he sat. Another clipped the surface of his left forearm, just a scrape. Wilmore fired until his magazine ran dry. He reached up with his offhand to unclip the box from his weapon. In his wounded state, he couldn't support the 18-pound rifle with his right arm. Its muzzle dipped into the grass. He finally wrangled the box free and hooked a full magazine from his plate carrier. He knew as he tried to fix the box to the bottom of the weapon that he'd run out of time. The hostiles closed on him. Wilmore forgot about the saw and drew his Beretta M9. He fired, dropping 3 more of the diseased before they pounced. Someone kicked him in the side. Someone whopped him in the shoulder with a galvanized steel pipe. Someone pulled his hair and drove a knee into his back. Wilmore managed to hold on to his M9. He worked the muzzle around until it licked the man pulling his hair's sternum. He fired. The man released and jolted backwards. Someone else took over where the man had left off. The guy crouched behind Wilmore and dropped his arms around his neck into an RC choke. Wilmore thought he smelled urine in the man's breath.
"We're gonna have you for dinner, you red, white, and blue son of a bitch,"
the man said. Urine breath wrenched Wilmore's neck, trying to break his spine. Wilmore felt something snap between his shoulder blades. He feared paralysis. Then he realized that he still clutched his M9. With great relief, he raised the weapon and aimed over his shoulder. Bam! Urine breath released his hold and fell away. Wilmore collapsed to his back and looked up into a football huddle of angry faces, each more scarred and diseased than the last. They kicked and punched him, raising bruises all over his body. The M9 had 10 more shots. He flung the weapon up and fired as quickly as his skill would allow. Bam! He blew a fedora full of brain matter right off a fat man's head. Bam! He sent a bullet up through the chin of a woman who looked like she could have run a yoga class if it weren't for her disease-riven face. Bam! He hit an older guy in the shoulder. The gentleman spun away, splaying a hand over his new wound. Bam! Bam! 2 shots missed their marks. An enormous man wearing a flannel shirt with cut-off sleeves and a cowboy hat kicked Wilmore between the legs. Wilmore winced and leveled his M9 at the man's chest. Bam! The man would never use those pointy-toed shit kickers to hurt another soul. Bam! Wilmore put a bullet through a woman's face. She looked like she could have been a doctor. She keeled over backwards and let out a sickening, guttural noise. Tap, tap, tap! Wilmore recognized the 3-round burst of an MK-16 in the distance. One of his attackers collapsed. The tall man with a Grateful Dead t-shirt lifted Wilmore's leg and rammed an elbow into his knee. Wilmore gritted down on the pain. At least he hadn't lost feeling down there. He aimed and fired. Bam! Bam! Both shots missed. The Grateful Dead fan rammed his elbow down again. This time, Wilmore heard a crunch. His knee gave way. He screamed as he worked his sidearm up. Bam! He hit the Grateful Dead fan right between the eyes. A runnel of blood poured from the wound. The guy let Wilmore's leg go and walked backward, clapping his hands and speaking in tongues. He made it a dozen steps before he cantilevered over onto his side. Someone drove a knee into Wilmore's ribs. Something cracked there. Wilmore looked up into the eyes of a bearded man with a nose hatched out into capillaries. The man grabbed Wilmore's face and drove his thumbs into his eyes. Wilmore groaned and blindly raised his M9. Bam! He touched off his last shot. The bearded man released Wilmore's face. Wilmore opened his eyes. Nothing but blur. He aimed his gun at the shadows and pulled the trigger. This time, the M9 dry-fired. Distantly, Wilmore heard another MK-16 3-round burst just before something hit him hard in the head and sent him into darkness. Chapter 34. Extraction plus 34 minutes. Tuttle, Peltier, motorcycle jacket. With at least 60 assailants closing the distance on Tuttle, Peltier, and the refugees, Tuttle readied his will for hand-to-hand combat. Any sentient creature would have withdrawn. Between him and Peltier, they had taken down at least a dozen dogs, but the others had just trampled over their brothers in arms and continued their advance. Tuttle attributed the mindless hysteria to the effects of HC4. He figured he had no more than 8 seconds before it would come down to bone on bone. He fired off 2 more short bursts from his kneeling position and stood up. He didn't want to be caught on his haunches when the bludgeoning began. From the corner of his eye, he saw Peltier rise. Peltier stepped out in front of the little girl she'd been protecting and continued to fire. Out of the entire detachment, none of the others could touch her when it came to marksmanship, and her calm, in the heat of contact, legendary. Tuttle couldn't ask for a more fit companion in a fight. Tattoos finished rattling off the last of his 15 rounds. He thought he might have hit one of the dogs, but he could be mistaken. He couldn't shoot for shit, but knew how to fight. He tucked the empty weapon into the rear of his waistband and stepped to the front of the group. Motorcycle Jacket moved to his side. Tattoos glanced over at his friend. Motorcycle Jacket winked, smiled, and raised his fists. Something in Motorcycle Jacket's eyes told Tattoos that the fat man enjoyed a good toss-up. A prolonged burst of machine gun fire came from the approaching dogs' right flank. Peltier looked away from her aim and spotted a sight for sore eyes. On the outskirts of the approaching mob, Wilmore stood, opening up on the bastards with his M249. The dogs responded to Wilmore's firepower by dropping off like mosquitoes. Wilmore kept the pressure on until the enemy split into 2 factions. About a score of them veered off toward Wilmore. The balance continued their advance toward Peltier, Tuttle, and the refugees. Both Tuttle and Peltier spent their last 8 seconds firing upon the hostiles. 4 more dropped before the dogs made contact. Peltier and Tuttle released the rifles and drew the Beretta M9s. Peltier glanced in Wilmore's direction. He stood toe-to-toe with an impossible number of hostiles. Wilmore changed his saw out for his sidearm. He fell to the ground, firing as overwhelming numbers overtook him. If Wilmore couldn't get up, he'd be dead in seconds. But Peltier had to deal with her own fight before she could help him. Tattoos and Motorcycle Jacket, fists up, engaged the dogs. Both men knew how to fight. Nothing fancy, just old-fashioned street grit. Tuttle dropped another dog with a shot to the chest. 2 others took his place. One of them leaped forward and grappled Tuttle's gun arm. Before Tuttle could react, the dog cranked it back and upward. Tuttle squinted in pain as he tried to regain control. He fired 3 times as he attempted to bring his weapon back to bear, unable to stop his finger from pulling the trigger. Peltier shot a woman with butch hair and a nose ring. She went down hard on her ass, dead before she realized what had happened. Wham! Someone hit Peltier from behind, right at the nape of the neck. An explosion of light flashed. Peltier collapsed. Chapter 35, Extraction plus 35 minutes. Orton, Wills, Henry, Giesing, Melvick, Tordoff. Just as Orton made the top of the Chinook's rear ramp, pain overtook his left thigh just below his ass. He hit the ground hard, clamping his remaining good hand down on a new bullet wound. He pulled his palm away for a look. Blood ran in a crosshatch along the lines of his hand. He tried to get up but couldn't move. Pissed off but resigned to his condition, he collapsed. He could only wait for someone to help him the rest of the way into the Chinook. Wills cursed the way his father had taught him. He aimed at the woman who had shot Orton with her hunting rifle. She'd pushed herself up from the waste of humanity Pitts' RPG had left and made a damn lucky shot. A shot she had no right to cap. Now, Wills' CO lay helpless at the top of the Chinook's ramp. The woman and Wills made eye contact. She read his rage. She aimed her deer rifle at him, pulled the bolt, and sent another round into the chamber. She fired. The bullet swished past Wills, close enough that he heard its locust whine inches from his ear. The woman pulled the bolt again. Before she could squeeze the trigger, Wills raised his MK-16 and fired. All 3 rounds penetrated critical mass. The woman slanted backward before crumpling into a pile.
Stay down and we will cease firing,
Melvick announced through the Chinook's PA system. Henry and Wills kept the rifles up, shifting their aim from hostile to hostile. The diseased horde remained prone. The hammer of a prolonged M249 burst caught Wills' attention. He looked across the field and saw Wilmore engage a throng of around 50 hostiles. The group had been advancing on Tuttle, Peltier, and their collection of refugees. The horde split into two factions, half continuing their advance on Tuttle and Peltier, the others sprinting toward Wilmore. Wills knew that if they reached him, there would be no hope. These animals didn't know when to stop. It was like HC4 had stolen all sense of logic. "Can you handle this?" Will asked Henry and Giesing. The two men nodded. Giesing waved Wills away. Wills sprinted off toward Wilmore. He didn't make it far before they surrounded Wilmore. Wills aimed but couldn't get a clean shot. Wilmore fell to the grass. With Wilmore down, Wills opened up with a series of 3-round bursts. Fire, run, keep the pressure on. As he advanced toward Wilmore, the animals took no exception to him. They had fresh meat in their clutches. They surrounded Wilmore and systematically beat the hell out of him. Wills continued his advance. Fire, advance, fire, advance, fire. Piece by piece, he took them apart as he moved to save his friend. Chapter 36, Extraction plus 37 minutes. Peltier, Tuttle, motorcycle jacket, tattoos. Peltier came around slowly as if she woke from a long night's rest. She felt calm, serene. She lay, where? In the middle of a field? And that noise, all that shouting? Someone kicked her in the ribs. She remembered everything. Her eyes shot open. She looked up at a half-dozen faces bent with anger. Diseased attackers peppered her with a barrage of kicks and punches. Thwack! Her nose broke under the crack of a garden hose blackjack. She covered her face with her forearms, wondering if death loomed for her just moments away. 2 tours in Afghanistan taught her that when a soldier meets their end, the rest of the company perceives a sense of unexplained predestination and closure. An odd phenomenon she could never explain to those who'd never been in combat. She wondered if, after this grip of infected creatures stole her life, her comrades in arms would speak of her as if she had spoken of so many soldiers with whom she had shared hell, the ones who had died on the fields. She wondered if they would simply say, it was her time. A chorus of yelling eclipsed Peltier's rumination. The half-dozen men and women in the business of kicking her bones apart faced something unexpected. Nearly a score of refugees from the First Salvation Christian Center attacked. They crowded in, swinging and kicking, grappling and biting. They insinuated themselves into the fray, intent on doing everything they could to end the dogged aggression. Peltier tried to get up, but her broken parts protested, unwilling to make the trip to her feet. She lay back, face to the sky, and thanked God that those whom she had saved decided to save her. Chapter 37, Extraction plus 38 minutes. Wilmore, Wills. The last of Wilmore's attackers fell, his heart exploding under the influence of a triple burst of 5.56mm rounds from Wills's MK-16. Wills ran to Wilmore's side. Wilmore lay with his face to the sky, one eye looking up at the clouds, the other staring off into another direction. His helmet sat like a turtle shell, 20 feet from his unresponsive body. Blood painted Wilmore's face and hair in clots and runs. One of his legs bent the wrong way. Wills crouched down to Wilmore and put an ear to his friend's nose. Nothing. Wills placed a finger on Wilmore's carotid artery. After 2 tries, he sensed a heartbeat. Weak, but present. Working quickly, he gingerly adjusted Wilmore's head position to clear an airway. "We're friends, brother, but I never thought we'd be this good of friends," Wills said. He leaned over and began mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, ignoring the smear of blood mopping onto his lips, cheeks, and palms as he attempted to put life back into his friend. Tuttle and a score of refugees approached. Tuttle crouched down to Will's side, but knew he could do nothing more than watch his fellow soldier work. Tattoos and Motorcycle Jacket carried Peltier between them, forming a makeshift chair by interweaving their arms and grabbing wrists. She lulled, drifting in and out of consciousness. Gracie stood next to her, one hand on Peltier's thigh, the other clutching Mr. Twinkle's. "Get her into the Chinook," Tuttle said. You, and you," he pointed at 3 men who looked strong. "Stay with me." Motorcycle Jacket and Tattoos carried Peltier away. The rest of the refugees, except for the ones Tuttle had ordered to stay back, set off toward the VTOL, the strong ones helping the weak ones along. Wills pulled away from Wilmore. He wiped the blood from his mouth with a sleeve, hoping for a miracle. Wilmore lay silent for a long moment. Then, as if ordered by some supernatural force, he took in a swallow of breath on his own. Wills smiled up at Tuttle. "Let's get him back to the Chinook," Tuttle said. Tuttle, Wills, and 3 refugees lifted Wilmore, careful to secure his neck, back, and broken limbs. Wilmore breathed on his own for now, but Wills didn't know if his friend would even make it back to the VTOL before giving up. Chapter 38. Extraction plus 47 minutes. Orton, Melvick, Wills, Giesing, Henry, Tortoff. The Chinook's PA system whined out a shrill of feedback as Melvick spoke through the handset.
Stay on the ground. We mean no harm. We will only retaliate if you commence firing. We are here to help. I repeat, we are here to help. If you allow us to extract the inoculated, we will do what we can to bring back more vaccine.
A man near the front of the prone pack of hostiles wearing a Hawaiian shirt wrangled up to his haunches. Tortoff aimed the Chinook's M249 at the man, ready to fire at the slightest provocation. Henry and Wills also trained their rifles on the man. "You didn't come here to help," the man shouted. "Look at what you've done." He swept a hand across the bloody mess all around him. Bodies, mangled and shredded, lay throughout the hardly living victims of HC4. They looked up at their would-be liberators, covered with crimson rashes, open sores, and bullet wounds. The Christian Center refugees reached the rear ramp. They helped their wounded into the womb of the big helicopter. "You should have let us be. You should have locked the gates and walked away. Instead, you say you came to help, but you did this to us. You don't get to be our saviors when you are the ones who consigned us to hell." Motorcycle Jacket and Tattoos carried Peltier up the ramp. By the time they reached the helicopter, she'd regained consciousness. She reached down and took Gracie's hand.
Remain on the ground. If you comply, we will do what we can to return with help,
Melvick said through the PA system. The man with the Hawaiian shirt ignored her order. Chapter 39. Extraction plus 43 minutes. Watson, Pitts. Pitts kept on with his nursery rhyme as he neared the Chinook, struggling with every step under the strain of Watson, who had stopped moaning and collapsed to dead weight. Arms and legs dangling unhinged all around his carrier.
"Your house is on fire. Your children are gone. All except one."
He lugged his friend past a group of refugees and up the helicopter's rear ramp. Orton lay just out of the way of the fuselage entrance. Having dragged himself the rest of the way up the ramp and out of the path of those coming aboard, Orton glanced up at Watson's limp body and fixed Pitts with a hopeless expression. In that instant, Pitts knew that he carried a corpse. He'd get Watson on board, then come back for Orton. Pitts gasped as he took in the scene. The gutted carcasses of Riggs, Krell, and Marwadell lay strapped to the floor. Refugees scuttled around, stepping over the bodies. They collapsed into shock seats and drew straps over their chests. Pitts laid Watson down next to the other 3 fallen soldiers. He crouched down and put his ear to Watson's lips. Watson breathed, shallow. and staggered.
He needs medical attention.
Pitts shouted at Tordoff, who crouched at the starboard gun port, manning the Chinook's M240. Melvick shouted over her shoulder, "We'll be in the air in a minute. Secure him. We'll get him to the base hospital as soon as we can."
I'm going back for Orton,
Pitts said. He stood and trotted toward his commander, but stopped when he saw Tuttle, Wills, and 3 refugees carrying Wilmore's unresponsive body up the ramp. Pitts stood aside and let them through. Wills and the others placed Wilmore on the floor next to the 3 dead soldiers. Wills tossed a look over his shoulder at Pitts. Pitts asked the question with his eyes. Wills shook his head.
So, 4 dead then.
Pitts thought. More refugees lurched aboard.
Get to a shock seat and buckle up,
Pitts said as he fought his way to Orton's side. Motorcycle jacket and tattoos placed Peltier into one of the shock seats. Gracie remained at Peltier's side. Peltier rested a hand on the little girl's shoulder. "Sit next to me. I'll make sure you're safe and sound." The girl glanced down at Mr. Twinkles and up at her rescuer. After a moment of consideration, she offered the unicorn to Peltier. "Oh, sweetie," Peltier said. "You need to protect Mr. Twinkles. Make sure nothing bad happens to him ever again. Get in this seat." Peltier pointed at an adjacent shock seat. Gracie nodded. Tattoos lifted her into the seat and secured her.
Sir, can you move at all?
Pitts asked Orton as he crouched down to his commanding officers.
I think I can with help,
Orton said.
Let's go.
Pitts put an arm around Orton. He ignored the commander's moans as he hoisted him to his feet. In measured limps, Pitts ushered his CO to his seat, helped him down, and pulled the straps over his chest. The infected man, wearing a Hawaiian shirt, moved into view at the base of the ramp. "Go then!" he shouted into the fuselage. Anyone with a weapon and a free hand drew and aimed. They held their fire. "Go tell them what you've seen here today. Tell them what they've created." The VTOL's engine revved up. The motors pushed into motion. "It's coming for you!" The man shouted as the ramp whirred up with the hum of gears and the hiss of hydraulics. "It's coming from the pipes and the cracks. It's coming from the gutters and the closets. It's coming, and when it gets you, only then will you understand. Only then will you know the hunger." The ramp closed. First Warrant Officer Melvick lifted the Chinook off. 34 passengers in its belly, at least half dead or wounded. Tordoff remained at the M240, keeping her eye out for threats from the ground.
"There are so damn many of them,"
she said. She spotted crews of infected all around the city as the VTOL gained altitude. A new group stood at the rail on the knoll's brow. Not as many as the first assault, but at least 50 men and women gathered there. Enemy reinforcements. Tordoff spotted something through the starboard gun port that chilled her blood. One of the infected at the knoll raised an RPG-7 and aimed at the Chinook. "Incoming!" Tordoff shouted. Pitts perked up and glanced out the window. He spotted the poor guy with the RPG-7. Click! The RPG-7 misfired. Again, Pitts chuckled to himself. The infected man, confused, inspected the rocket launcher. Close call, Melvick thought. She remembered to breathe as she guided the Chinook over the eastern concertina wall toward air traffic control, out of the San Fernando Valley Annex. Chapter 40. A television sitting atop a portable cart streamed YouTube in the Oval Office. President Arnold Dischel sat at the Resolute desk, fingers splayed over his face as he watched the live stream coming from within the San Fernando Annex. A woman reported live. She wore probably the best she could find in the Annex to pass as a reporter. A dark blue pantsuit with a gray top. Blood spattered her blouse in a wash of dots and pools. She'd pulled most of her disheveled hair back into a ponytail. She wore no makeup, giving her the look of someone much older than her early 30s face and figure. She stood in the middle of a park, dozens of bodies splayed on the grass behind her. This is Rachel Sanchez reporting for Barry Langevin, live from Tongva Park. Inside what we have learned, y'all are calling the San Fernando Annex. Sorry to say that Mr. Langevin, the famous frat barbecue video maker, can't report due to being permanently shut up by the United States military. Show him, Eddie. She gestured off camera with her eyes. The camera panned over to reveal the broken body of Barry Langevin, laid out, spread eagle on the grass. President Dishel and his aides grimaced at the sight of the self-proclaimed reporter's remains. The camera panned back to Rachel. That's right, the president of your country dispatched a small group of company assholes to come into our home and take out almost 100 people. I'm happy to announce, however, that we sent your brigade of army losers away licking their wounds, Mr. President. On that note, all we want is to be left alone. If you try to send any more so-called help, you will find us better armed and better prepared for another round of kick-ass. Lana Joyce, the press secretary, used a remote control to mute the television. It's not as bad as it seems, sir, she said. The president looked up at her. Can you somehow qualify that delusion? Lana gestured toward the YouTube stream where Rachel prattled on with her manifesto brand. Smoke from the scattered fires choked out the entire sky behind her. A building in the distance danced in flames, casting off a massive surge of black ash and exhaust into the atmosphere. They are making themselves the enemies here, Lana said. Embrace these infected lunatics. Show them for what they are, a stark representation of what our country faces if we don't band together. All we have to do is tell the truth. We're making progress fighting the vaccine. We're on the front lines of the battle. And how is the vaccine coming? The president directed the question at Dr. Ingrid Primwell, director of the NIAID. I'm afraid we've lost 3 more survivors from the San Fernando Annex, Primwell said. We're working on it, but so much of the process comes down to trial and error. Having subjects injected with the serum inhibitor before infection is helping. Let's hope for more trial and less error, the president said. We are doing what we can. The key lies in the serums we're developing from the survivors' blood and that of the remaining soldiers. The president closed his eyes, let his head lie back for a moment. How are our boys? Not well, I'm afraid, General Winstonson, Secretary of Defense, said. They're all quarantined. Symptoms are worse in some than in others. We lost Watson this morning, and some of them have, exhibited signs of madness and eccentric appetites. But none of their names have been released, the press secretary broke in. Even their own families think they're still alive and on assignment. What do you want to do with the other soldiers, sir? Winstonson asked. Let's just say we aren't going to give out any medals, the president said. This Rachel Sanchez is making them out to be war criminals. Can't afford to polarize Americans any more than they already are. How are the other annexes holding up? We've created 16 new annexes. We're doing what we can to contain the virus, but it's a race against time. Time that we don't have, Dr. Primwell said. HC4 is breaking out of the annexes. We see more cases every day. The president stood up from behind the Resolute desk and paced back and forth across the room. All remained silent as they watched him move. Dr. Primwell, you will have every resource the American government can supply. Personnel, experience, equipment labs, and quarantine spaces. Just find us a vaccine. Mr. President, the resources are helpful. But what I could use is authorization to take a more invasive approach to trials. I know we've talked about this before, and you have given me your flat and direct refusal. But if I can have some leeway, I think I can save millions of lives. The president folded his hands behind his back and resumed pacing. All eyes watched him as he made his way across the rug from wall to wall and back again. He stopped behind his desk, splayed his hands on the hard wood, and leaned forward, head down. He explored the wood grain patterns on the desk's polished face. He looked up at Press Secretary Lana Joyce, an expression of Consideration, culpability, gains, and consequences lit on his face. Joyce looked back at him, stoic. Something in the president's eye sent a chill into her blood. He asked her with a single expression,
If I authorize Dr. Primwell's proposal, can you fix it?
She considered the question, staring back at the president with a series of micro-intimations moving across her face. She closed her eyes for a long moment. She let them drift open. She nodded at the president. One by one, the president looked each of his cabinet members in the eye. One by one, they nodded back at him. President Arnold Dishel pushed off the desk and stood his full height.
You have your leeway, Dr. Primwell. Go make a viable vaccine.
Yes, sir, Dr. Primwell said. He turned away from the president and left the Oval Office, letting the door drift and click closed behind him. This has been Red Annex, written and read by Craig Nybo.
Oh, there ain't no resolution for the institution, sanctioned execution. Oh, there ain't no resolution for the institution, sanctioned execution. Goes on and on and on until the end of days. Oh, no passive griever can change procedure in our furious endeavor. Oh, no passive griever can change procedure in our furious endeavor. It goes on and on and on till the end of days. Never make the mistake that you can ever change the leopard spots. I said, never make the mistake that you can ever change the leopard spots. It goes on and on and on until the end of days. Oh, there ain't no resolution for the institution, sanctioned execution. Oh, there ain't no resolution for the institution of sanctioned execution. It goes on and on and on until the end of days.
For the song On and On, I wanted to cast the raw grime of war. So I went with some down and nasty blues. I did very few retakes because I wanted it to stay messy and chaotic. War is messy and chaotic, and it's something that we have in the world every day. Funny thing is, wars are fought by just a handful of sociopaths at the top, with very little consent from the men, women, and children on the ground who die in the thousands. I'm not picking sides, and this is not a political show. But I have to say that I constantly scratch my head wondering how so few men at the top can get away with so much death and devastation. For you combat veterans out there, I thank you for your service. Thanks for joining me on this 10-part story. I loved writing Red Annex. I hope you enjoyed listening as much as I enjoyed producing it for you. Please get behind the show by visiting patreon.com/terrifyinglies and selecting a backer level. Just a few bucks every month helps keep this show on the air. Here's the best part. We still have 3 episodes left before we reach the season finale. I invite you to return. Join me in these depths of insanity. You might just find yourself leaving a fragment of your sanity behind. Believe me, in this world, these days, you won't even miss it. Until we meet again, I wish you sweet dreams. Or should I say, sweet nightmares.
This has been the Terrifying Lies podcast. Please, come again. You're welcome here.